Hi, you are in the Putting the Community Back into College session. I hope that those of you who have decided to really hedge your bets and sit all the way in the back row will grant us the courtesy of joining up front so that we can actually have a sense that we're speaking to other people, and that hopefully the panelists who've made themselves available for this will be able to engage in discussion and Q&A with you as well. My name is Miriam Rivera, and we have here a very distinguished group of panelists. I know that you all have had access to their bios, so I will just present who they are so that it's a little clearer if you're sitting all the way at the back and you're unable to see their names. This is Paul Friedman from Altius Education, Bernadine Chuck Fong from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, Phil Bronner with American Honors, and Alan Alberding, who is the president of the Joyce Foundation, but also the vice chairman of the Chicago City Colleges. So I think for a lot of us that have had the opportunity to speak a little bit before the panel, I'll give you a little bit of background in terms of my interest in this area. I was a kid growing up in Chicago, inner city schools. I didn't speak English when I first started school. My mother raised 5 of us and had an 8th grade education. So we saw education as really the future for our family. And through great teachers in the Chicago Public Schools, who took such an amazing amount of interest, I'd say that at least 3 of us were able to finish high school out of 5 kids. 2 have not. 2 of us went on to get both bachelor's and advanced degrees. And I think that the story of our family is not atypical for a low-income Latino family in an urban setting. And for many people, the community college system is really the promise of the American dream. It's the ability to access that dream. But as a student who was very fortunate, I went to private schools on scholarship in high school. I went to Stanford University on a scholarship in college. I went on to get advanced degrees from Stanford University with some amount of financial aid. I also sense that these institutions in many ways may not be the most cost-effective way of helping students to get their degrees. Many people enter the community college system with the ambition of going on to 4-year colleges. Probably, this system educates the most students in the country. It's the largest educator of minority and low-income students in our country, and yet maybe 20% of students actually graduate from an associate's program and are able to transfer into 4-year degree programs. We spend billions of dollars. In California, we've actually cut our community college budget by $1 billion alone in the last few years. So these institutions are working with incredibly diverse student populations with even less money than they've done in the past. So, perhaps we're spending about $5,000, $6,000 per student compared to 4-year colleges, which may spend, between 10 and 20, and at the elite schools, maybe up to $50,000 per student per year. So we understand that they have a lot of challenges. In many ways, our community college system has tried to be all things to all people. They are trying to provide work-related education for many people who really want to just transition into jobs. But again, somewhere between 50 and 75% of the kids coming in say they want to go on to 4-year college, and only 20% do. So they're not really achieving that metric. And we know that there are many jobs that require college education. In Silicon Valley, where I'm from, you can't find enough people with the right kinds of college education to fill large numbers of jobs. So the question is, are community colleges failing to meet the needs of employers and failing to meet the needs of students? And can we do something about it? I'm going to actually ask Ellen to start on the question of, are the community colleges actually preparing students for employment? There are many people unemployed and many jobs going unfilled. And what do you think community colleges can do about that disconnect?
Well, thank you. I just want to emphasize that the challenges that we have as a community college system are massive. We have 125,000 students in city colleges, so that's more students than Northwestern, DePaul, University of Chicago, and all of the colleges in the Chicago, four-year colleges in the Chicago area combined. It's a lot of students. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that most community colleges, ours included, about a third of the students are adults. So they are working, they've got kids, they probably, they may or may not have done high-level work in high school, and they have a lot of challenges, including language skills challenges. In addition, 90% of the students coming into our system require remediation in 1, 2, or 3 subject areas. So in a system like ours, you're dealing with some fairly major challenges to getting people through. So how are we addressing that? And getting people through, from our point of view, is not just transferring to four-year schools. There is a percent of our students who do transfer to four-year schools, and we are very much encouraging that. But by far the majority of our students, we consider it a success if they get a certificate or a 2-year degree that leads to employment. And we are holding ourselves accountable not only for completion rates, which is the standard that most community colleges use, but our job placement rates, which is a much higher standard. And I'm not saying we're succeeding. Our graduation rate, our completion rate now is 11%. So we have a ways to go. We are nowhere near the top performing community colleges, but even they are, in the 30s. It's a tough set of circumstances. But one thing that we're doing is aligning our curriculum with the needs of employers. So we're working directly with employers to figure out, what do you need, and we will provide it. And that means even allowing them to design curriculum, allowing them to say, I need programmers in this software and not that software, and being directly responsive to the needs of employers. And that we have a new mayor whose name is Rahm Emanuel. If you've met him, he when he gets focused on something, you better get focused on it, because that's what he wants, and he's determined to get it. And this is one of his top 3 priorities in the city of Chicago, is making sure that the city colleges are responsive to the needs of employers and getting our students into jobs. So there's a whole set of things that we're doing around that. But that's the rubric that I go to every board meeting, understanding that that's what we're about. And that means you make a lot of decisions about how we're using our resources that are controversial and difficult for the longtime employees of the city colleges. There are a lot of folks who think city colleges are the gateway for education for so many people, and that it shouldn't be about job placement. And we understand that, but that's not what we're doing. We believe it's our mission to get folks into the jobs that exist. And I'll give you one small little example of the kinds of issues we had. For a long time before we had this current chancellor, we had people teaching software programming skills that was Donkey Kong kind of stuff. I mean, completely out of the mainstream. And we had employers unable to find workers to do basic programming. Like Groupon, for example, which you may have heard of, was a fast-growing company. They had hundreds and hundreds of jobs opening, and we weren't teaching the software that they need for their business. So we changed that. That's one small example of the kind of thing that we're trying to get at.
Paul, could you also address how Altius works with corporations and employers that are looking for well-prepared students?
We don't, and that's actually one of the reasons why I think we're able to be more successful. I mean, if you look at there's no doubt that community colleges are probably the most important functional area of our higher education system. If you look at society's biggest problem around education, it's how to get more people more education. That's not what Harvard does. Harvard creates an environment of exclusivity and limits the number of people who come through the door. What we need for transition to a knowledge economy are more people getting educated, and that's what community colleges are built to do. I think one of the biggest challenges at community colleges that is self-imposed, not the challenges of a very diverse and difficult a student population that generally comes from very poor K-12 environments, a student population that is generally first in their family to go to college, a third working adults. Those aren't self-imposed constraints. The self-imposed constraint of the community college system that we currently have is that it has multiple missions. It is a employer, what was just described as a very difficult process, working with employers in a certain area, designing programs to meet current job needs. That's really important. That's one mission. A junior college is an entirely different mission, and it's entirely different student need, it's entirely different alignment of programs, and then community colleges also have the mission of having to be community serving organizations. If people want to take a class at a level of interest, they could take a class at community college. Those three different missions make the job of actually managing community college tremendously difficult. So Altius has a program called Ivy Bridge College, which is an online transfer college. We only do the transfer function, right? So we specifically focus on making sure that we built programs that are aligned to what four-year institutions want to see from a community college transfer, and it sort of ignore the mission of direct to job placement. And as a result, the students that we have are aligned to that mission. The faculty that work with us are aligned to that mission. Our curriculum is aligned to that mission. I think it makes our job significantly easier, and is part of the reason why we see much greater success rates than you see at most community colleges.
So one of the impacts of these kind of graduation rates, and when you combine it with the diversity of the student population, is that these community colleges are the place where the majority of minority students, Latino and African American students in the United States attend college. So these graduation rates essentially mean that we are limiting the pipeline of people in both four-year education and in careers if they really are not becoming employable in the community college. Bernadine, could you address your sense of what we could be doing better so that we are not making community college the place where these students' dreams go to die?
Well, I've been in community college all of my professional career, 36 years, and starting as a faculty member and then working my way through administration, and was president for the last 12 years before I retired, and then joined the Carnegie Foundation. And I think one of the big issues is that the community colleges, for those of you who may not know, 45% of the entire freshman class in any given year go to a community college. So that means 55% in four-year schools. But the majority of those students who are looking for somewhere to go, and they're not looking at a university, they're going to be at a community college, and they are not necessarily the ones who don't know what to do with themselves. But having said that, in answer to your question, I think that the role of the community college was to be an open door. And it really was also to be open access, so anybody could go whether or not you had a high school diploma, didn't matter what your grades were, didn't matter what your SAT scores were, et cetera, et cetera. And so the community colleges had a very huge mission, is we're going to take anybody and everybody walking through the door and then try to get them to a level where they're employable or where they can transfer, et cetera. And that's a huge mission, and it's also, when you're looking at massive education, that it's a huge challenge. So having said that, the community colleges then are trying to focus, as Ellen said, on the workforce or on transfer, as Paul said. But at the same time, they've got a whole lot of students who really don't know what they want to do. And the community college faculty come in with, and I'm going to be critical now about my colleagues, they come in with their own set of standards. And the standards that they come in with, if they were educated at an Ivy League school, we had faculty members at my college where, look to your left, look to your right, and some of these students won't be here. How many times have you heard that when you're in an elite school, but you shouldn't hear that at a community college, but you do. And also, in terms of the employers, that the community colleges really do acknowledge that their role is to connect with the employers. But quite often the employers don't connect with the community colleges. For example, Google, your former employer, Miriam. And so they're looking, when they're trying to hire, they're looking for graduates, frankly, from the upper level colleges. They're not looking for community college students. They're probably not even looking for state college students. And so there's an elitism that goes on among the employers about whether or not you're going to acknowledge that community college students are employable by your company. And I think that's a huge problem that the community colleges have. I think recently, beginning with the Bush administration and now the Obama administration, there's been much more recognition of the role of community colleges and how they really can help the marketplace. But that's only relatively recent compared to what's been going on in the past. I would also say that, you know, the elephant in the room in this entire summit has been that I think it's been wonderful to see all of the technology that's here. When I was president of Foothill in 94, 95, we started the first online platform, believe it or not. It was the first online credit course. And think about 94, 95. Blackboard didn't exist. A lot of those companies didn't exist. So here we were doing our little online platform for credit. And we ran into all kinds of hurdles, from the legislators, I should say, to university schools, because they said you can't transfer because we don't know whether your students took the class because we don't know who they are, they might have cheated. You've heard the whole 9 yards. I have to say as an aside that our software developer for this platform was our computer science teacher. He's probably the only one in the world who's the software developer of an online platform who has an Emmy and a Golden Globe, because he was also the co-producer of the TV series 24. But having said all that, the elephant in the room is, I think, and I acknowledge it, and I would really like at some point people to address it, maybe at the next summit, is how do you get the institution to really change and really understand and embrace technology and what technology can do for it? What I see is a lot of interesting and fascinating learning tools here. I mean, if I were back in my old job now, I'd want to adopt all of them. But at the same time, you still have the classic classroom, you have the classic faculty member, you have the faculty member standing in front of the classroom. And until we start changing some of that, and to what extent technology can facilitate that, I think we've got a real problem. The last thing, though, on the employers, I think employers also need to learn something about what it means to get a general education as opposed to a very narrow education. When I was working with like Hewlett-Packard, Intel, et cetera, we wanted to have a degree that would certainly help students, whether it was mass design or some other kind of fabrication or programming and Java or whatever else. We said they still needed to have a basic education because the jobs would change. The employers in those days, we're talking now about in the 80s and 90s, said, no, we want people who could only do this. And of course, as you may know, maybe it's before your time, but when mass design fell out of the marketplace, then all of a sudden we had all these people, the employers had all these people trained in mass design fabrication, but then they couldn't do anything else. So I think general education is really an important part too.
So let's talk a little bit about the populations that we're serving and some of the abilities for technology to help in those populations. So one, we see that about half of the students in community college need some level of remediation. You mentioned that it can go as high as 90%, for example, in the city colleges of Chicago. So there's a very large population of students that are needing more from the system than just an ability to go on to four-year college. They actually have to be brought up to a college level before they could even think about transferring. So I'm going to ask Phil to address this, because I know one of the things you mentioned is that at the community college level, you didn't feel that there was enough technology to kind of support the community college systems in addressing the needs of their students, and how you see technology being able to help either those students who are in the remediation area or those students who want to go on to four-year degrees but find that environment so challenging that, you know, their ambitions kind of terminate at community college.
Sure. So before I answer your question, I'll sort of frame it by what we do. And so we sort of try to address two things that were discussed here. One was the breadth of students that community colleges wrestle with. And the second is technology and how you can bring technology into the system. So if you look at part of the challenge within the community college, which has been discussed, they have multiple segments that they're serving. So 60 to 90% are remedial. They have a number of students who are pursuing certificates. They have lifelong learners who are coming to take classes. Then they have some who are interested in transfer or on the honors track. And if you look at either the administration or faculty in front of a classroom where all of those students are literally in the same class. So you may have a student in English Lit who wants to be a welder. You may have one who wants to transfer to a great school and another who is, has an undergraduate degree in engineering and is now going back because they have an interest in liberal arts, and you're teaching them all, right? And so how do you manage that? And so what we do is we partner with community colleges to allow them to more effectively serve their honors student population. And so from a community college president perspective, we allow them to segment, right? And so allow them to segment and focus on one of their sub-student populations. And it's not the 60 or 70% that are remedial, which is where a lot of their dollars have to go. Because the other thing that we haven't fully talked about is the fact that the budget cuts you're talking about limit the resources that these community colleges have to invest. And so when you look on average, community colleges spend between $6,000 and $7,000 per student, even when you take into consideration the state subsidy, which is dramatically less than any other four-year institution that's out there. As you know, private institutions can spend as much as $50,000. So not only do they have the diversity of student, but they have it at a very low price point. And so what we do is we put scaffolding around the community college to enable them to focus on their other student populations while we support them around honors. And so honors students are going into the community college to focus around potentially receiving their degree at a more affordable price. And so what do? The first thing we do is we put them into a cohort. So everybody in the class is that 3.5 or 3.6 or 3.7 student, because we all know you learn as much from the other students in the class as you do from the faculty member. We then help them provide a more rigorous curriculum. So the curriculum that they receive is similar to what you would receive at a university. And then we focus on advising, and so that's another issue at the community college. Given the lack of resources, the student to advisor ratio can be 1 to 750, 1 to 1,000, or in California it can be 1 to 2,000. And when you think about the academic planning of a community college student, it's very complicated, specifically when you're thinking about transfer, because not only are you concerned about the classes necessary for you to get your associate's degree, but you have to also take into consideration what school are you transferring into, what program are you transferring into, are you taking the right classes in the right sequence so that they're accepted. And so we help them with all that stuff. And so given we're a third-party provider providing scaffolding, it allows us to leverage all of the technology that you guys are hearing about here. So often when we go into these community colleges, we can bring the best of breed across all aspects of the technology value chain. And one thing Miriam and I were talking about earlier, prior to founding this, I was an investor, and when you look at a lot of the ed tech companies that are out there, they focus initially on the four-year space. So they also focus initially on universities, and then community colleges adopt the system. And so what you find is that a lot of the problems within community college that are specific to their domain, so think transfer planning, there often are a number of software companies who are solving that. So a lot of our engineers are really focused around that as well.
And I'm going to ask Bernadine to address issues of remediation in particular, because I know that you're working at Carnegie on one of the tough nuts to crack, which is in the math area. And how do you get students remediated in areas that are often requirements for them to be able to move into different professional areas and into four-year programs? I know you've had a lot of success with your math programs, and I'm curious, what you're doing and what you would say all community colleges could do to try to achieve some of the results that you have achieved through the Carnegie math programs.
Well, to tag on to what Phil just said, my goal, and if I were to change your business plan, Phil, it would be to get the remedial student into your honors program, because I think that's what the goal of the community college can and should be. As far as remediation, many of you may or may not know that developmental math is the primary gatekeeper for not just community colleges, but for higher ed in general. And 50% of the California State Universities, much less community college students, but 50% of the California State University entering freshman class test into remedial math. So these are students who have a high school diploma, who have already acquired supposedly the math background that they had to achieve to get that high school diploma, and yet they test in a remedial math at the university level when they've already been accepted by that university. At the community colleges, this is even more severe, and so it's a major, major problem. We also think it's a high leverage problem. The Carnegie Foundation wanted to put its resources behind so that we could really get students through to the honors programs that are frankly at most community colleges today, whether through Phil or through other auspices. The issue we felt, and we think we were one of the few people that could do this. The Carnegie Foundation, by the way, this is for the advancement of teaching. We're not the Carnegie Corporation in New York City, which frankly has all the money. So we are an operating foundation living on Andrew Carnegie's endowment. He started 40 foundations, by the way. But what our role was and is to really look at how do we change the actual education within the classroom. So we can reconceptualize the mathematics curriculum, we changed the pedagogy, and then we really came up with how to look at how to better retain students. And so in terms of the curriculum, we looked at, and many of you, I'm sure all of you have been through some form of math curriculum getting to the college level. So if you start with a student, when we say remedial, we're talking about a student who is eligible or at the elementary algebra level, most of which of us probably took it in high school. So these students now are 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, and they're still at the elementary algebra level. So how do we take them to and through a college level math course that is more efficient, more effective, and more interesting for them, and where they will do better? And so we literally looked at the entire math sequence, which is anywhere from 1 to 2 years. If you're starting at elementary algebra, it's 1 to 2 years before you get through that college level math course. And that's assuming that you pass every course along the way and can get on to the next course. So we shortened that, and we basically put into a statistics course what you needed from math to understand statistics. So it wasn't all of elementary algebra, it wasn't all of intermediate algebra, it's what you needed for statistics. We had another pathway called quantitative literacy. So what do you need for quantitative literacy to be able to finish in that course? What do you need in the realm of mathematics? So we shortened the trajectory, and I would not say this in education circles, but since I'm in a technology circle, we basically eliminated the intermediate algebra requirement. Now that's huge, and it could start math wars if I were saying this more publicly. And because intermediate algebra as a single, what do I want to say? A single requirement, is really not what should dictate what students can do, and it does not predict their success. I have to tell you that there's an assumption even in the Common Core standards, because a lot of your companies are revolving around the potential market from Common Core standards, is that the idea there is that if you have intermediate algebra, that whether you're a math major or not, that it becomes an indication of college readiness, and we would tell you that it isn't. Basically, by all the changes that we did, we're now in 40 campuses, and we've actually been able to change the trajectory. So normally, students going through from elementary through college level math, it'll take probably in 1 year 6% will get through, 15% in 2 years, and about 18% in 3 years that they'll get through college level math. So we've been able to get our students through in less than 1 year with 51%. So we had huge gains. We think this is something that can make a difference, but it really has to do with changing the pedagogy and the curriculum content. And for those of you that are into instructional or educational technology, that's where I would urge you to focus your attention.
Bernadine, one thing you've also mentioned in other settings is addressing some of the issues around persistence and what helps students to persist. And I think that for students in remediation, that's often a big issue, because time after time, there are studies that show that just the fact that it takes so long to get through community college, and then going to community college actually adds time to the amount of time to complete a bachelor's, that many students are just deterred in the process of getting education.
Right. The work that we're doing along with these pathways, what's embedded into our course is what we call productive persistence, as Miriam said. And so this has to do with how do we better engage the student and retain the student? Well, part of that is understanding who the student is and what are their learning barriers. Now, if you talk to educators, the educators are going to say, well, it's low CES, it's basically underrepresented minorities, it's underprepared students, and, what are we going to do? And so therefore, you throw more tutoring at them, you give them more class hours, You may hire them a coach. There's companies that have been set up to just do all this kind of coaching and mentoring and so on and so forth. However, you're all barking up the wrong tree, to be very frank, because what we've found in the work that we've done in looking at who these students are, we developed a math background and student background survey based on a lot of research and a lot of help with the psychometrics of it, that the primary indicator and primary predictor of student success, at least in our math courses, is the level of anxiety, no surprise, the amount of social belonging, and the sense of comfort level in the classroom, and also student mindset. So for students, we ask them a question. Do you think the following comment is true? You're either a math person or you're not. 87% of our students thought that was a true statement. You're either a math person or you're not. If you've got students believing in that, no amount of tutoring or any other kind of learning support is going to make a difference unless you can address that. So we did. We have a 15-minute exercise that is embedded into our curriculum that actually teaches students that, you know, the mind, the brain, that is a muscle, and like any other muscle, it can be more flexible and can be more malleable, and so therefore you can exercise your brain just like you exercise any other part of your body, and therefore you develop much more of a growth mindset. So what we were able to do is we established the baseline of students' perception of what mindset was, and then we engaged in this particular activity, and 3 weeks later we actually saw a change in the students' sense of mindset. And we actually saw this was a better predictor, as well as the other social non-cognitive factors. These were better predictors of student success than race or ethnicity or social class.
So I'm going to ask Paul a question about, it seems like both you and Phil may be working with the population of students that's actually more prepared than average. I'm not sure if that's true, but kind of given that you're working towards a four-year degree program, I would think that that population is a little different from the remediation population. But are there things that you're doing with that population that you think could be applied more generally to all community college students and achieve better outcomes for them?
So 70% of our students are actually placed into remedial classes to start. So our business is a little bit different than Phil's. You know, we're not trying to create a silo for the students who are more likely to be successful and sort of put them in a cohort by themselves. You know, we are looking for students who are different sort of on average than all community college students because they picked the mission that fits for them. They are our students that want to go and transfer, which is something like 75% of community college students in general, and we only serve those students, but we do have a high percentage that are remedial. One of the things that we do that was just described that's worked for us is to teach growth mindset as well. We found the same thing that sort of borrowing from Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset, that students who think that they're either smart or stupid, or they get math or they can't get math, that mindset is going to be a meaningful block on their capability of struggling through difficult material and ultimately getting better. It changes the way that they think about assessment, because a bad grade means that somebody's labeling them as stupid. And one of the first classes that we require people to take, sometimes before the math sequence, is a class on the growth mindset, so they get sort of out of that framework. And we've also seen the same thing around the demographic data being instantly overwhelmed by data based on people's expectations and performance. Most of the students that we serve have an academic aspiration, and they've been told somewhere in society has told them that education is the key to something better, a better life, a better job, something aspirational. What they tend to not have, at least the students that we serve, is a lot of academic confidence. And they've probably been told, at different points in their lives, that they are stupid, or that they can't make it, or that this, college isn't the right environment for them. And so, our early interventions are around changing that mindset. We do provide every student, with a coach whose responsibility is to help reinforce that attitude, to help with time management and work skills. And I think that those sort of aspect of coaching and student support that's proactive and actually looks into the student population and sees when students are changing their behaviors in ways that are predictive of them not returning to class is extremely useful. Teaching students about about how their brains are actually work, which is different than they've been told their brains actually work, is useful. And I think that those kind of things can be useful for all students. I think the other thing that was also mentioned is figuring out how to teach less to teach more is useful for remedial students, and is also useful for students across the spectrum of community college students. We make mostly because a lot of the curriculum have been faculty led, and you talk to somebody who has a PhD in mathematics, and they'll start a math war with you, which probably is a very interesting thing. That argues that you have to teach these 100 things in a sequence, and they will argue that every single one of them is important. Reality is that if you try to teach a student 100 things in a semester or 8 weeks, their retention of them is going to be very small. And if you actually boil down to the most important concepts that are actually relevant in their future academic lives, and teach them at much greater depth, they're much more likely to retain what you've taught them, and they're also much more likely to be able to figure out the things you didn't teach them, right? And so, if we were to kind of boil down the things that we've had success with that I would think are applicable, I would say, sort of getting students out either through a formal curriculum or some sort of instructional model, out of a mindset that they're either smart or stupid, and that's sort of baked in, and the college process is just about discovering that. Providing some aspect of out-of-classroom support that helps students manage the much more complicated lives that community college students tend to have when they come to a college environment, and then focusing the curriculum on that which is most important, so students are more likely to be successful. And I think that's useful for remedial students, and it's useful for the high-achieving students.
I can follow up on that. One of the things that I learned when I got involved with city colleges is that just getting into a remedial class is a really bad thing for a lot of kids, because and adults, they never get out of the remediation process. And some of them maybe shouldn't get out of it, but a lot of them shouldn't be in that classroom to begin with. And I think it's very much reflective of what you're saying. There's a mindset that goes along with that. And so, okay, so that's a problem. We see that that's a problem. How do you solve that problem if you're running a big institution? Well, how do these students get into remedial classes? They take what's called a compass test, and they get a score, and the score then tells the school they need remediation or don't. So but unlike your children or any of you, when you're taking your ACT or your SAT, you take out the book and you study it, and you're prepared to take the test, and you go to bed a little earlier the night before. These students are going through this insane registration process, standing on lines and all this stuff that you can't even believe. And then somebody says, oh, go into that room and take the compass test. They don't even know it's coming. There's no preparation for it. And so a lot of them fail it, even though if they did a little preparation, they wouldn't fail it, and then they would be more likely to succeed because they'd be placed into a regular classroom, and they wouldn't have this, thing hanging around their neck about being in remediation. Now, that's not for every student, but it's really worth doing a little preparation for the compass test and figuring out, how does our big institution go turn the ship and get the students a book to help them prepare, tell them that they're taking the test, and suggest that they read the book before they go in, and you have great results, remarkably. The other really interesting thing that we're experimenting with is that the Education Testing Service has a new way of assessing which students are going to succeed. You probably know about this, but I'll just describe it, which is essentially looking at grit or persistence, their behavior in the classroom, and saying, okay, it's not just that compass score, because students, even if they have low math scores, if they have these indications of persistence, succeed at a very high rate in the regular classes. So let's identify the students that have this high degree of grit or persistence, or whatever you want to call it, and you can screen for it. And even if they have low scores, let's get them out of remediation and into the regular classroom, because they're very likely, like 86% of them, succeed. And that, it sounds like such simple stuff, but it's, changing a whole system to get our system to do that is not as easy as one would hope. The other thing I would say is that there's not enough good software that's designed for this population. I mean, because it's not perceived as a good business particularly, but actually I do think it could be a good business. So I wish there were more folks like the folks here who were focusing on that. And also, here's a business idea. There should be somebody doing a Consumer Reports type project to help people like me figure out where we should be investing, which are the products that are more likely to help our population. I sit there and I'm sitting at a board meeting and we're all, and it's cameras and it's Open Meetings Act and all these people show up to watch us, and we get a board book with 75 contracts or 100 contracts that we're meant to approve, each of which has one page. And a lot of them are software that's meant to address the issues of our neediest students. I shouldn't say I have no idea, but like you just don't, I wish there were a better way to get information, a ranking system or some sort of external stamp of approval. We get great advice from our staff, of course, but from a board point of view, it'd be nice to have some other ratification of which of these things we ought to really be investing in. So, business idea, somebody should go out and do that, and you can.
So a
we would
Yelp
buy it.
version, right? A Yelp version
Yelp.
for educational
No, not
technology.
Yelp. Well, maybe. I'm not a big Yelp fan, but something like that.
So this is actually brings up a good point, and we've had this notion of kind of continuous improvement in education and how we can bring it into different spheres within education. And you kind of talked about how just looking at our process of how is it that students are tested, how is it that they learn that they're going to be tested. I mean, really basic stuff. It sounds like the City University of New York is experimenting with a program they call ASAP. To help students graduate, and they have been able to double their graduation rate by just doing things like block scheduling classes and saying if you really do want to go to four-year college, then you have to do this full time. So these seem like pretty minimal kinds of re-engineering ideas. What can we do more to provide a continuous improvement mentality and look at these outcomes and start getting people to shift behaviors?
One of the things that we have tried to do, and then this is more the Joyce Foundation than City Colleges, but we sponsor the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence. We're trying to establish standards for what is excellence.
Great.
We just gave one of our prizes to one of the CUNY schools in New York. What is excellence? And let's reward them. It's $1 million prize, so it's not trivial. But also we're trying to get them a lot of publicity so that they're recognized and their leadership is recognized and others are encouraged to follow the patterns. There are community colleges that are highly successful. What is the magic that they have? What is the stew of ingredients that they have that's working for these populations that other community colleges like the one I'm involved with are really struggling with?
I think, if the way to generally improve processes as described, is through a series of tests, of A/B testing different process changes and holding an outcome constant and seeing which one improves results. There's some complexity in that in a community college context, because not everybody would agree that something like graduation rate is what you're supposed to optimize for. So there's some herding of cats to get people to agree to an underlying metric, but that's not that hard. I think what's harder is creating a mentality where people can feel like experimentation is possible. Right, it's creating a mentality that says, we're actually going to try two different processes this year for our incoming, students. One is we're going to do the test, we're going to give them 3 days to prepare the test, and the other that we're not. That kind of concept in higher education is very difficult to execute, but that is how you end up seeing process improvements. You can certainly there's value in seeing institutions that have worked and try to boil down what that has made them successful. And sort of spreading that information to the market. I see a lot of value in that. I think there's much more value in creating an environment where every community college can experiment with their own population and make determined process improvements, measuring their results, and then seeing which ones work for the students that they serve. That requires a mindset shift at the community college, but that's much more likely to sort of spread success.
So it sounds like a number of you are working on ways of communicating best practices within the community college arena and rewarding experimentation and outcomes. Bernadine, I know you're also working with this notion of networked improvement communities at Carnegie, and could you address how that fits into this notion of continuous improvement?
So one of the issues is that we really need to, and I say everybody here in the room, if you're involved in education or educational technology, you really have to reach the faculty. Because you can't reach the faculty, everything is going to be on the periphery. And so the faculty is at the heart of the university as well as the community college. So having said that, one of the things that Carnegie's been doing is really focusing on network improvement community. So what does that mean? We modeled it after the work of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, IHI, in Boston. And they, several years ago, launched a campaign, and it was really to save 100,000 lives in the medical field people who lost their lives due to medical error. And so they wanted to put in a system of improvement so that the hospitals, the doctors, the nurses could really first identify what were the causes of these medical errors, how to prevent them in the future, and basically then how to save 100,000 lives that would have been lost. And so we looked at the same kind of model for education. And so you think of student minds as being the lives of individuals. And so how can we save 100,000 minds, if you would, in terms of being relegated to remedial education, never getting out of our system, never being able to be successful. And so in a network improvement community, you use the principles of improvement science. And interestingly enough, this is really based on the work of Toyota, the car manufacturer. So Toyota Kata is, and also the work of Atul Gawande, who has published a number of best-selling books, including The Checklist. And he's a MD. And so what we're looking at is, well, how do you make, in this case, education more efficient, more productive, more effective, and with better quality, which are all the goals, frankly, of Toyota when it's manufacturing its automobiles. Hospitals now around the country have adopted this model, and so why not education? And so what we're looking at is how can we, first of all, get to what are some of the root causes of what are the issues that are occurring with our students and with the lack of progress and success. And then I just gave you an example when we looked at productive persistence and getting into, well, what was really the root cause of why students were not learning successfully, rather than looking at superficial causes. And then how to really first try to have an intervention to address that particular cause, and then to measure the effectiveness of the intervention to go forward. So this is really a movement that we're trying to start at the Carnegie Foundation in the field of education, is improvement science, applying that to the field of teaching and learning, and how do we improve the work of the teachers. And what teachers tend to do, yours and mine, is that they teach how they were taught, and they kind of assess whether or not they were effective by either student evaluations or whether or not, you know, they got warm, fuzzy feelings from their students or something like that. I can tell you right now that there's no evaluation that exists, at least in higher ed and certainly in community colleges, that evaluates a teacher based on the number of A's, B's, or C's. Because, of course, that's something that would be anathema to teachers, because we can't control how well this, you know, my teaching, I'm doing a great job as a teacher, but you may not be doing very much as a student studying, right? So I cannot be graded on the grade you get, because I'm not responsible for how much you study.
Actually, can I just say, we just negotiated a contract with our teaching force that includes student performance as part of their evaluation, and I'm very, very proud of that fact. It was not an easy battle, but we have a contract, and it's in there.
So the part of improvement is really to get people to think about what are the metrics, what are the underlying root causes of the problem, and understanding the problem. It sounds like a very simple question, but when you ask people what's the problem, you get, frankly, very superficial answers. And so we ask why 5 times. Well, why aren't the students successful? And you ask that same question 5 times, and you actually finally then do get to the root of the answer.
So I want to ask one last question, and this one I will have each panelist address, because I think it's kind of a big picture question, and I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on it. The notion of what is going to happen with community colleges in the next 20 years. In your ideal mindset, what would they look like? What would they be doing? How would they be different? How would technology be a part of that vision? Phil, why don't we start with you on that one?
Sure. So when you think about community colleges 20 years from now, the hope would be that they're still the entry access point for higher education. And so when you think about all the problems we've talked about, the low price point that they offer still enables a wide segment of our student population to get their start. The hope is that technology can make them more effective. And, you know, it's interesting because I think there are a number of issues that community colleges wrestle with that are different based on different student populations. And so, although we focus on honors students, and they may not have some of the remedial problems that we've discussed on this panel, they have a number of other problems that prevent them from graduating in a reasonable period of time. And those issues are issues that can be solved very effectively through technology and other things. And so again, a lot of students are just taking the wrong classes. They're not taking classes that are allowing them to graduate in 2 years. There are some students who are struggling with remedial classes and other things, but like, that's just a fundamental issue that can clearly be solved by academic advising software. There are other students who are smart students, or they're remedial students who life gets in the way, and so they miss a few weeks, and when they try to transition back into the class, it doesn't allow them to effectively pass that class. That class is a prerequisite for another class, and so they end up spending 3 years and they drop out after the second year. There's like a lot of issues that are sort of fundamental within this system that can be solved, and the hope is that technology helps us solve that. I think a number of other things that are going on, like some of the online education initiatives, MOOCs and other things, can also be leveraged within this context as well to improve the quality of some of the teaching that's going on. And so I think there's a lot of things that can happen. The key thing is that it's still the key entry point is the access point at a very low cost, and the hope is that a lot of these tools and technologies and a lot of the things we're talking about enable us to increase dramatically the graduation and transfer rates.
Helen, would you address that from your perspective, both as a representative of a community college and also trying to increase employable people in the city of Chicago?
Right, so I completely agree with those previous comments, and obviously we care about all of our students. My particular passion is for low-income adults who are using the community college system as a way to step up in the workforce. And we have so far to go in order to improve their outcomes, but I think the impact on that population could be massive if we just did a better job with it, if we did a better job of orienting ourselves toward what employers want, thinking, 10 years out, and providing the kind of counseling so that adults are not taking the wrong classes and are on a clear path. They decide what they want to do and they're on a clear path to getting there. That's where I hope the community college systems are able to improve from my point of view. And obviously we care about all the other students as well, but.
And Bernadine?
I would totally restructure the community colleges. I don't think they can survive the way they're going. And in California, we had a tax measure, Prop 30, which was to basically bail out higher education for the next 3 years. I voted no, and the reason I did is because in 3 years, we're going to have the same problem again. And the issue is that the colleges, and community colleges, but also universities, they're not focused on their customer. And so if you go to the business community, and I hear it all here about your customer, you have shareholders and you have all this other stuff, but it's the customer, because if the customer doesn't show up at your door, then you're out of business. And frankly, community colleges don't think that way, mainly because there's so many customers there that they don't really worry a whole lot about enrollment. Like in California, there's an enrollment cap, so think about that. So in other words, if we have more students coming in than above our cap, we don't have to take them because we don't get funded. My philosophy when I was at Foothill was, well, we need to take every student who comes in the door, even whether or not we're funded or not, because it shouldn't be based on how you're funded, it's based on what your mission is. But the issue is that they need to be focused on a governance model that is mission focused. So it's focused on transfer, it's focused on remediation, it's focused on student development, and not focused on constituents. And if you get inside a community college, where I've been, is that they're focused on, what do the faculty want, what do the staff want, what does the board want, and not so much on what's best for the students in terms of what our mission is. So I would just totally restructure from ground zero.
Paul, you get the last word.
Yeah, I voted for Proposition 30, but that's just because I enjoy paying more taxes. So.
And believe me, there'll be another proposition 3 years from now.
Proposition 31, and I'll vote yes again. I'm crazy that way. I agree with largely what was just said. I think the community college system needs to be entirely restructured. I don't think it's sustainable in its current form, and I think it starts with institutions that focus on the differentiated missions of community colleges. I think that it's a very different thing to teach a short-term certificate program for a specific job outcome. That's a hard job to do. Community colleges have historically done that very well, and that's one kind of institution. It's a very different institution that services, somebody who's looking to go to an elite four-year institution just needs a non-traditional path to get there, and I think that those missions need to be separated and really done by separate institutions. I think that there's a tremendous role for technology to play to make that process more efficient. If you look at the expensive part of community college, the infrastructure is tremendously expensive. Building more buildings is unlikely to happen, but now that we've built these buildings in a lot of different places, we can leverage those a lot more effectively. So using technology to support learning outside the classroom, and then using the actual facilities of a community college to allow for peer interaction, or the kind of more expensive problem of interacting with the faculty, I think shows a lot of promise. I would caution one thing about the use of technology, and I think it was mentioned before that there's a lot of community colleges make themselves really difficult to sell to. As a used to be a technology vendor and selling to institutions, and community colleges are the worst. They're like K-12 in terms of they're like big public institutions in terms of the length of the sales cycle and the difficulty of the RFP process, but then they don't have any money, so it's not worth the process. And as a result, it's not because people don't care about students who go to community college; they desperately do. And if you interview, most entrepreneurs who are in ed tech, a lot of them are here because they want to change the world and they want to help people, and they would love to start with the people who need help the most. But when the rubber meets the road, they can't figure out a business model. So what they do instead is they build things for elite institutions, and then eventually they'll hire a salesperson to go, modify it and try to sell it to community colleges. And as a result, it's not built for a community college student, right? And I think there's a lot of discussion and promise around MOOCs, particularly MOOCs developed by, edX and, former Stanford, on sabbatical Stanford professors. And I think that, I think that there's a lot of promise in that style of education, a lot of promise in making open, low-cost courses, but I find it very hard to believe that Harvard, whose very mission is exclusivity and elitism, and that's part of their ethos, is going to be the institution that democratizes access to education. I just find that impossible to imagine. That's not what they're built for. And if you ask an average Harvard professor how to teach a community college student, they would fail miserably. And so I think that we need to figure out a way for there to be solutions form fit, designed specifically for community college students that leverage the facilities that they have. But I think really to have any kind of success, there needs to be a restructuring of the business model. And finally, I'll agree one more time, which is community college there needs to be some pressure on community colleges and people at community colleges to think about the student first. I mean, you mentioned using an analogy of something that was successful in the medical industry. Medical industry has a nice pressure, which is malpractice insurance, right? Forces malpractice, being sued for malpractice, it forces doctors to care to some degree about the outcomes of their patients. No, I don't think there's ever been a community college professor who's been sued for malpractice, although probably many are deserving. And what's a disturbing fact, that coming from the Carnegie Foundation data is, Carnegie data is right. There exists now in the market a solution that, if I wrote these numbers down, that can change an average success rate over 3 years in remedial education from 15% to 1 year over 51%. That's unbelievably phenomenal. The disappointing note in the same statement is that it's only at 40 campuses. There are 2,300 campuses, community college campuses, round figures. If you had that kind of success in any other business, everybody would have it overnight. It would be instantly adopted. And so the fact that distribution of successful solutions is such a challenge says that there's something wrong about the incentive structure of people who are involved in being able to make those decisions at community colleges.
I think the only thing I would say to that, and agree with everything that's been said. Here's the challenge as I see it. You have $6,500 per student. You have the diversity of students that you're trying to serve, as we've talked about. You have 60% remedial, you have certificate, you have honors, you have all these various things. We all are talking about segmentation, But segmentation by definition requires more resources because you're going to focus on these subsegments. How do you do that is the fundamental question. And I think, the type of thing we're doing solves some for a segment of the community college population, but you have to figure out how to wrestle with that question, because right now one of the reasons it's one size fits all is because that's the lowest cost way to do it. And so when you really start to focus on these subpopulations and you're looking for other vendors to help solve the problem, like where do the dollars come?
Yeah, well, but I don't think it's undoable. We have 7 campuses in city colleges, and we are segmenting. We're taking one campus and making it the medical campus. We're taking one campus and making it transportation, distribution, and logistics. We're taking one campus and making it transfer to 4-year institutions. We have, you mentioned that we have buildings, we have resources. We're just reorienting them. Yep. We're using the building, one building is going to be for one thing, one building is going to be for another. The faculty is going to be specialized. It is a doable concept, at least for an institution that's as big as ours. We've got a very, very large institution. So I think it's a great thing that you guys should keep talking about it and flogging people on it, because I agree, and I also think it's not just a matter of resources; it's a matter of will.
Yep, agreed.
I really appreciate that positive comment to bring this session to a close. I'd like to take a moment to thank the panelists for what's been really a very lively and interesting discussion. I know that there will be probably another session in here, but if people are able to, I'll ask them to hang for a few minutes if you have like a burning question or a burning comment that you'd like to make. Please, let's thank our panelists.